It's interesting. I like to juxtapose the Mary's kind comments about compliments with just some of the terms that are applied to auditors. And I noticed that Kevin had one in his presentation when he was discussing the individuals that are responsible for showing the warts on the institution. So I'm not sure if auditors, I know that he intended auditors to be, here, I can stand closer to this, Mary. Yes. Auditors to be part of that group. So we're purveyors of warts. We also had, I had a friend, CFO in higher education, that would always tell me, Mark, you guys, auditors, are the ones that come out on the battlefield when the smoke clears and you bayonet the dead and the dying. So, pretty flattering description of what auditors have to offer. I would like to just, I would like to talk to you in the few minutes that we have this morning, just give you a quick overview of auditing at the coordinating board, because it does touch your institutions. And so I'll give you a description of how we might come about interacting. And then I'll also talk for a few minutes about just auditing resources that you would have at your disposal from a variety of sources. So at the coordinating board, this is a pretty typical audit relationship, both public and private sector, to where the audit director reports functionally to the governing board and then administratively to the chief executive officer. This is an important relationship because it preserves and it promotes the independence of the audit function. And that's how we're structured for our function as well. So you can see we have compliance monitoring, internal audit, and federal subrecipient monitoring that report to me. The touch point for how we might be at your institution is our compliance monitoring function. So I'll talk briefly about that, and then we'll talk a little bit more generally about other audit resources. Our compliance monitoring function began shortly after I arrived at the coordinating board in 2012. It sort of was born out of the Sunset Review Commission, their analysis of our agency, and then it was adopted by the legislature. So there's two areas that we look at in compliance monitoring at your institutions. Mary talked about the funding structure for agencies and the whole formula funding process earlier. So our compliance monitoring function is very much and even legislatively called upon to look at the accuracy of data that supports the formula funding process. So if you'll recall, she had a slide that shows that about 60% of the formula funds, the $4 billion annual distribution of those funds, about 60% of that is driven by the infrastructure and operations formula. And so one of the key components that she mentioned was student or semester credit hours. That's what our compliance monitoring function is looking at when we come to your institution when we do a formula funding audit. We look at the integrity of semester credit hour information that gets reported to the coordinating board, and then we have program areas within the coordinating board that take that information, that cleanse it, that ultimately summarize it, and then present that information to the LBB, and that's used to distribute the funds to your institution. So our function at the coordinating board through compliance monitoring is to make sure that the information that's being reported is accurate and correct. We also look, the second area, this is a legislative mandate, is that we look at student financial aid that's distributed. It's trusteed to the coordinating board, but it's distributed to institutions of higher education around the state. And so This area is obviously an important one, the whole discussion of funding the cost of higher education, the discussion of the burden of student loans on our students. And so what we're doing from a compliance monitoring standpoint is really tracking the institution's receipt of the funds that come from the coordinating board, and then the appropriate compliance and expenditure of those funds so that we can make sure that they are really being used compliantly, efficiently, and effectively. And again, we come back on both of these areas, we come back and report our results to the institution's chief executive officer, as well as to our commissioner and our governing board. This is just the background of our compliance monitoring function. The agency was tasked with negotiated rulemaking, and so we worked with representatives of institutions from around the state, public and private, in actually developing the rules that govern our compliance monitoring function. This is just a few blurbs about our interaction with you and your staff. When we come to your institution, all of our work is, we work with start with the chief executive officer in terms of notification and reporting, and then work with designees and work in a way to try to minimize disruption and ultimately get information back. Kevin talked about, just the, I guess the qualitative aspects of information, making it as understandable and providing it as timely as possible so that informed decisions can be made. Before I quickly touch on some other resources that are available to you, just a couple of, there are a couple of hot button topics that we've hit on our compliance monitoring engagements that I would call to your attention. They're not a part of the slides, but two areas. One is information security. And so if you think about your institution's enormous amount of student information and other types of information as well, but student information, when we come out to do our compliance monitoring engagements, we have to determine, can we rely upon the information systems that are generating or controlling the data that we're looking at. And so in order to do that, we typically look to see, have other audits been performed that we can rely upon, or if not, then we have to ask some very basic questions about the protection of student information and how that process is managed. And surprisingly enough, we've actually had some difficulties in that area, and so our reports have indicated that. We've worked closely with presidents of institutions that where we ran into those difficulties, and working with them to help recommend processes that can be established to do some fundamental things, just like how do you grant access to student information? How do you align access so that an employee only has access to the information that they should be able to access? How do you remove access when an employee changes positions or terminates from the institution? So there's some pretty fundamental questions to be asked and answered there, and so that's just one suggestion that I would have from a governance or fiduciary responsibility standpoint is your student information being adequately safeguarded and protected? The other area quickly is relates to student financial aid, and we had a situation, and this is really particularly bad because it was our student loan program, and what we discovered is when the coordinating board funds a loan for a student that's at your institution, the institution does the vetting process up front and sort of, I guess, qualifies or pre-qualifies the individual that they're eligible, they're taking enough hours and so forth to receive a loan. The coordinating board does the promissory note aspect and then ultimately sends the funds to your institution, and then the institution takes those funds, applies it against the student's fee balances, and then if there's any remainder, there could be a distribution of dollars to the student. But typically, it goes towards the student's fees, and everything is good. But what we discovered is that institutions we would fund the loan, send the dollars to the institution, but the institution, for various reasons, would not go forward with the loan to the student. In other words, they held on to those dollars, sometimes to the extent of 10 or more years. Those dollars remained with the institution. So I think you can start to see the very serious problem that creates, because the coordinating board pursues the loan based on a promissory note and the assumption that the loan was dispersed to the student. The institution held those dollars, did not distribute the funds, and the student, so the student ultimately then gets in this, and this affected dozens of students at the two institutions that we recently looked at. The student then ends up paying for a loan that they never received, potentially. Several of them were, there was a judgment status associated with non-payment of a loan that they never received. So some really very, very negative consequences that came to bear directly on students and student financial aid. So my plea to you is that as a person in a position of oversight, to ask the question about student financial aid clearing accounts. Those dollars that come to your institution, if there are old dollars sitting in a clearing account, if those funds date back several years, it can end up having very dire consequences on, that come to bear directly on students. So we're correcting that situation, working with those institutions. We're putting controls in place to give us an alert in a more timely manner so that we know when something's gone off course like this. But that's just one of the sort of current hot topics that we're working on. There's other resources. As an internal auditor in the state of Texas, whether you're with a state agency or a institution of higher education, the state has the Internal Auditing Act. So this really defines the practice of internal audit in the state. It talks about the professional standards that we're to follow. It talks about a risk-based internal audit, an annual plan that's approved by the governing board. And it talks about reporting. It talks about an external peer review every 3 years for your internal audit function. So a lot of good information over the requirements of an internal audit provider in a state agency or institution of higher education. Other audit resources, the Texas State Auditor's Office, they do audits around the state in all sorts of agencies and institutions of higher education. And they typically have a contact manager that is assigned for your institution. So there is an ability to have a dialogue with somebody from the state auditor's office if you have a question that you would like some advice from a statewide perspective. And then obviously federal auditors, DOE, and others. One resource that I thought of from a governing board standpoint that or senior administrator standpoint is a document, and I have the reference there on the slide. It's 20 questions to ask about internal auditing, and it's really, they divide the questions into several categories, but it's an easy read. And these are good questions that really should be asked and answered in a meaningful way about audit services within your organization. So it talks about such things as internal audit role and mandate, your relationships between auditors and management. It asks questions such as, what's the appropriate amount of audit resources for your organization? How do you go about considering something like that? Do you have enough resources? Do you have too few resources? So that you can make informed decisions based on a discussion of that information. Lots of information that I covered very quickly. I'd be happy to answer any questions that you may have. Yes, ma'am.
Sarah Martinez-Tucker with the University of Texas System Board of Regents. My question, I'm going to go back to the example you used and ask maybe a two-pronged questions. At public companies, and we've talked this morning about the difference between universities and public companies, we have a tendency to rely on internal controls and the external auditor. So I'm curious how an institution could hold on to an undisbursed loan for 10 years and not have some sort of internal checks and balance. I wouldn't expect that board members would have to get to that level. And then secondly, a long time ago when I was in the administration, federal student aid reported to me, whenever we disperse funds, we did our own quality control checks. I'm wondering about the coordinating board having its internal checks on the funds that you disperse out to the universities. 10 years seems like a long time to have those funds sit.
Sure. Both good questions. How did this come about? Sort of, what were the causes of this? You have, really, to me, it kind of came down to the 80-20 rule, I think, and we're still considering other universities. We still don't know if we have the full. That's why I asked that potentially you ask the question within your institution, because we're still trying to assess if there are other loans that have not been dispersed that are out there. But it's sort of the 80-20 rule. So typically you have diligent people and a fairly effective system of controls, reporting, quality control within an institution that would have prevented something like that. You would have people monitoring, clearing accounts, asking the question, what are these balances? Why are we carrying this balance from one year to the next year? But then you have the 20% that have turnover in key personnel, that changed a student financial aid director, or maybe they went through 2 or 3 student financial aid directors in rapid succession, and so nobody was minding, house. Nobody was checking on those things, and so then when the 80% person came back on board eventually and started looking and said, what in the heck are these balances related to? That's when this information ultimately got brought forward. So that's part of the issue. The other, aspect of this is really, we looked at it. We issued reports that not only pertain to the institutions, but also to the coordinating board, because there were some controls that were not in place from our standpoint to be assured that those funds were distributed. And so that process is now being developed, working with the institutions on, the best way to report that information. So there is no question as to the distribution of funds. So sometimes, the very basic things can escape the eyes. You would ask the question, why didn't those institutions' internal auditors, learn of this situation, or the institution itself? And no easy answers to that other than just, a lack of diligence and oftentimes turnover, and the corporate history is sort of lost, and controls are not paid attention to. Anything else? I'm between you and lunch, so thank you very much. I appreciate it.